Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's classroom session of CLC1 Supply Chain for Health. This week is linked to module number 6, which is downstream functions, warehousing, transportation, and hence we are focusing on outsourcing. Although it's a broader term, but outsourcing of warehousing and transportation is quite common in health supply chains. So we will learn broadly about outsourcing today, and then more towards warehousing and transportation. So today the strength is a bit less. Uh, so hopefully more students will join. We apologize for a small mistake on informing the time. The time was always same, 4 p.m. local time. So thank you everyone who have joined. Um, so let's begin today's session. And as and when people join, that's okay, and they can look at the recording as well. So for today's session, we will understand the concept of outsourcing and how to approach it. We will also look at some case examples, and if possible, have a discussion with you if some of you are willing to speak, at least this time. As usual, if you want to speak, you can raise your hand, or you can put your questions or comments in the chat. Um, if any questions can't be answered during the session, we will make sure that those questions are answered and sent to all of you by email. Okay. So to begin with, let's understand at a high level what is outsourcing. So outsourcing is typically when any organization they contract out their own core or non-core processes, sometimes less critical works or services, to the best placed organization, which is a third party or a specialist firm. It can also be an individual, it can also be a firm. So when core or non-core services of an organization are done by an individual or an organization from the outside, which we generally call a third party, then it is outsourcing. Outsourcing happens everywhere, as we will see in this session. Um, for example, as you see on this slide, there are different types and categories of outsourcing depending on what is being outsourced and how it is outsourced. So from process outsourcing to IT to knowledge to operational to project, professional, manufacturing, and multi-source where more than one types of process or activities are being outsourced. Um, Outsourcing is very common in pharmaceutical manufacturing, where one manufacturer, which is a big manufacturer, they outsource production of their pharmaceutical products to a smaller contract manufacturer. It is quite common in the public health sector, where specialist development specialized development activities are outsourced to consultants or consulting organizations or implementing partners. That's also outsourcing. And it is also quite common in supply chain where warehousing, transportation, procurement can be outsourced. Okay. Let's understand a bit more about outsourcing by understanding the various issues that a public sector organization can face and how outsourcing can be advantageous to them in addressing those issues. So any public sector organization, they may face issues like lack of in-house expertise or very high turnover of employees. And I'm sure you must have seen in your organizations or in your country, maybe in Zimbabwe, excuse me, maybe in Zimbabwe as well, that public sector organizations they struggle with high turnover. So as soon as people are trained, they leave and they go and start work with private organizations or organizations who are funded by donors, because that's where they get better salaries and better working conditions, which is okay, which is perfectly fine. But then what does that public sector organization do in that scenario? What they can do is they can outsource specialized operations or activities. For example, if you see on the screen, technical assistance for warehouse, pallet localization, or developing annual plan for training and capacity building. If these kind of activities, they don't have internal capacity or skills, it is something that they can outsource. Similarly, public sector organizations can also face issues like having limited resources. Now, when I say resources here, I mean budget. So sometimes public sector organizations may have limited budget to expand their own team. Now, as you can understand, uh, recruiting people takes longer time and is generally more expensive rather than rather than having consultants working for a shorter period of time who can execute the work which is needed. Similarly, in terms of transportation, if I talk about, there are several times when public sector organizations they may face limited volume or variable demand. Both are linked to transportation in a sense that the amount or the volume of products that they are transporting within the country, it is quite less that if they invest in vehicles, it may not be that cost effective. So in that case, they can leverage existing third-party service providers, contractors, transportation agents who can do the work for them. Similarly, variable demand is something which is quite common in public sector, where demand of certain products can be quite less uh, throughout the year, and then for a few months it may go up. It may peak. So to manage those variable demand, public sector organizations can take help of third-party logistic provider. Okay. Uh, Similarly, if public sector organizations are facing issues with inefficient service delivery, now that is something they might be facing because for any Ministry of Health or public sector organization, transportation may not be their core area of expertise, and hence they don't may not know exactly how to manage it. However, if they outsource this activity to a third-party logistics provider, which are generally private for-profit organizations, their efficiency may lead to better service delivery as well for the public sector. Okay. So on this slide, we just wanted to show you various issues that public sector organizations may face and how those issues can be mitigated using outsourced providers. Now, okay, I'm sorry, haven't had my evening coffee yet. Okay. Yeah, but this is not to say that if there is a systemic problem in the organization, that for example, if let's say there is a stock out issue, there is a frequent stock out issue in an organization. Okay. Without understanding the root cause of that stock out issue, if the organization tries to outsource some of their functions like warehousing or transportation, it may not really result in improvement in the stock out rates, because maybe transportation may not be the issue, it may be something else. So first thing here for any public sector organization before outsourcing, and we will see that in the subsequent slides, is to identify clearly what is the root cause of those issues and if outsourcing will address those root causes. That is very important to understand. We will see that in the next slide as well. I'll ask this question at a later stage. but let me also show you different categories of health services which can be outsourced. And as you will see here, almost every other uh, public health or health service can be outsourced, depending on how the organization is looking at it, whether they consider it as a core area of expertise or a non-core area of expertise. And if the organization has resources to manage those in-house, or they would like specialists to come as outsourced providers and manage it for them. Similarly, in a health facility or a hospital, we can also categorize outsourcing based on risk. So here, this is another example of risk-based outsourcing in a health system, where if you see, uh, everything can be outsourced, but any facility or hospital would like to keep the high-risk areas within their own control, and the low-risk areas may be outsourced. So hence, you may have seen in bigger hospitals that for the laundries, food services, transport services, security, sometimes laboratory or data analytics, these services are outsourced, while more core activities and core services that the hospital or the facility provides, they are managed in-house. Okay, so that's the basic principle of outsourcing, where core processes are generally kept in-house, or high risk processes are generally kept in-house, while non-core or low risk processes are outsourced. So this is how generally organizations decide to go towards outsourcing. So at this point, I would like to ask the question, that is outsourcing recommended everywhere, or there are certain areas where you would never consider outsourcing? So if someone wants to answer that question, please do that in the chat, or you can also unmute yourself and speak out. I will take a quick 10 seconds break in the meantime. Okay, the question is this. Let me go back. The question is this. This on the slide, that is outsourcing recommended everywhere? I mean, can you outsource like almost everything, or there are certain things that you will never consider to outsource? Okay, no one. So let me then move ahead. Like I said, the answer to this question is based on, um, okay, Tendai is saying no, but with no justification. Okay, yes, Tendai, outsourcing cannot be recommended everywhere, but it depends on how an organization looks at the areas of services that they provide, whether they consider certain non-core services or low-risk services are, if, if they can be outsourced or not. Generally, any organization, they identify their key or core area, and they like to keep that area or the activity related to that area in-house. Okay. Now, I'm just saying there are some instances where you can outsource, depends on the risk. Nomination will be. Yes, exactly. That's true. You're absolutely correct, Namsa. So moving on. So how do you plan? How do you plan for outsourcing? So on your screen here, you see the outsourcing life cycle, which starts at strategic assessment, need analysis, supplier assessment, contract management, project initiation or initiation of the activity, relationship management, then continuance or exit, and then the process keeps on happening over and over again. Okay, it's a circular process. Now, we will see in the subsequent slides what is meant by strategic investments, needs analysis, and so on and so forth. But the key here, which I said a few slides back, is that before deciding to go for any outsourcing project, and the organization must do an analysis of what are the problems that they're facing, what are the root causes of those problems, and whether outsourcing will solve those problems. So these questions can be asked during a strategic assessment and needs analysis phase, and some other questions related to this phase uh, can be asked here. So let me, yes, very good. Something has happened to this slide. Okay, a slide is missing from this deck. Not sure why. Yeah. So a slide is missing. Priyanka, can you please check the previous slide deck that we did for Nigeria? There's a slide where we talk about these steps. I don't know why this slide is missing. Let me check from my deck. It's also missing here. That's really great. Okay. Okay. Anyways, let me just talk about it then. So there's a slide which we will add and resend the deck to you. So when we talk about strategic assessment and needs analysis, we look at the processes that we want to outsource. We decide whether those processes, can be outsourced, and if outsourced, they will work well. We look at the issues within those processes and try to understand how those issues will be resolved. We also do supplier assessment. So if, let's say, you're looking to outsource transportation, so you need to look at the private sector market to see whether there are suppliers who are there in the market who can who can support you in outsourcing of transportation. If there are no third party logistics provider in the private market, then you cannot outsource. Okay. Similarly, you also need to take a look at your budget. You need to take a look at different stakeholders that you need to convince to go for outsourcing. You need to look at external issues like if your outsourced provider is coming from outside of the country. Let's say if we're talking about sea freight. So how will you manage payments, your foreign reserves, currency exchange, those kind of things as well. Now, once you have figured out that, okay, we are going for outsourcing, then comes the part of contracting. So you need to issue an ITB or an RFP, depending on what you are trying to outsource. Seek proposals from suppliers, evaluate those proposals, and then get into a contract with your preferred supplier. Now, the key in managing contracts with outsourcing providers is to have the right expectations from the very beginning. So you need to make sure that you write key performance indicators in your contract. You mention all the metrics that the supplier needs to take care of. Now, for example, in case of transportation, if you want them to deliver within a certain time period, you need to write that in the contract. If you want your suppliers to deliver, products at 100 different locations, you need to mention that very correctly in the contract, and any other condition or any other information that needs to go to the supplier must be part of the contract. Then once the project starts, there are two things that has to happen side by side. One is the relationship management with the supplier, and the second is monitoring and evaluation of the supplier's performance. So the KPIs that you had agreed with the suppliers, they need to be checked quite frequently, let's say on a quarterly basis, and then at a agreed time point, a full performance evaluation also must happen, based on which you may decide whether to extend the contract or exit the contract and do the process once again. Okay, so it's very important to look at the entire cycle, and then enter into any contracts with outsourced providers. Now let's see what can be outsourced in a supply chain. Now a lot of things can be outsourced, from custom clearance to freight forwarding, procurement, warehousing. Warehousing can be outsourced partially or fully. Transportation can be outsourced. In this case, we're talking about distribution in country, because freight forwarding and sea freight we have covered earlier. You can also outsource security of your warehouses or your facility, and you can also outsource management of data information. Okay. However, in-country transportation is the most common supply chain function, which is generally outsourced. Okay. At this stage, there is a quick poll to understand what is the most common function, supply chain function, that is outsourced in Zimbabwe. So the poll is on your screen. Do let us know what is the most common function, supply chain function, that is outsourced in Zimbabwe. Okay, we are starting to get some results. We have about, I think we're about 10 people, so I expect 10 votes. There are 5 votes left. Please look at the poll and cast your vote. Okay, no more. We only have 5 votes, so if, okay, 6, okay, 7. Okay, so let's stop it here. There isn't much of a consensus within the group on what is the most common outsourced function. So as you can see, we have voted on all the functions almost more or less equally. But I believe even in Zimbabwe, between in-country transportation or procurement would be some of the most common supply chain functions that are outsourced. Um, moving on, we want to learn from a case where case from World Food Program, where I also want to emphasize a bit that why are we talking about outsourcing. As you can see from World Food Program, they have a massive global operation, okay, where they deliver food and food products to population in need, in crisis, in conflict zones, during floods, earthquakes, fires, wildfires, so to say, and of course, sometimes in areas which are heavily impoverished. Okay, so similarly, if World Food Program at a global level works efficiently with outsourced service providers, why can't uh, health supply chains in the public and private sector, they have to manage their own distribution? Now when public sector organization manage their own distribution, following issues happen. Sometimes facilities, the staff of the facilities, they have to come and collect the products. So generally the staff which has to go and collect the product is the pharmacist. So instead of dispensing products, the pharmacist is actually doing the work which the pharmacist should not be doing. Similarly, any public sector organization, if they want to invest in their own fleet, they will need a massive capital investment, which otherwise they can utilize in other areas, which are their more core areas of servicing. So if we try to learn from World Food Program, as you see, and this data is about 5 years old, more or less, if not more. So it may have increased with more conflicts happening globally. So they utilize 5,000 trucks on a daily basis. And out of those 5,000, only 800 are their own vehicles. Everything else is outsourced. Okay. Uh, they have a basket of pre-qualified logistics service provider. LSP is logistic service provider. So they pre-qualify those providers initially, and then they run RFQs with them, biannual RFQs. So every time there is an RFQ, they ask the supplier to quote for a particular volume of products, and contracts are issued. Subsequent contracts are issued for 6 to 12 months period with performance assessments and regular KPI reviews. Okay, so with this way, uh, World Food Program ensures that they do not invest heavily in purchasing trucks, in recruiting drivers, and also spending a lot in vehicle maintenance. Instead, they use those funds to buy more food products, organize more advocacy programs, and try to reach out to more people who need their services. Okay. So similarly, in the health sector, ministries of health or supply chain or organizations who are managing product supply chain, health product supply chains in the country, they may look at what their core activities are, invest more on their core activity, and identify logistics service providers who can help them in transportation of products. Now, in some countries, it may not be possible because the country just may not have, good transport providers. Because if we're talking about health products, all outsourced providers must also adhere to good storage and distribution practices. So if they can't, then there is no choice but for the Ministry of Health or the supply chain organization to assume those roles, even if those are non-core activities for them. Now, uh, if someone decides that yes, we want to consider outsourcing, so what are the different areas they need to look at? Now, again, going to that cycle that we had created, uh, within that cycle, when we're doing the assessments, so we have to look at internal and external conditions more deeply. So when we talk about internal conditions, we talk about everything that is related to the organization. For example, competency, core competency, which operational processes are not performing well and can be outsourced, or if outsourcing of one function can improve the performance of another function, if the organization has the ability to manage external vendor, and if outsourcing can be technically and politically feasible and justifiable. So these are some internal conditions that organizations must look at. Similarly, they must also look at external conditions. Like I said, supplier assessment and maturity assessment and understanding the cost. Okay. So like I've been saying, uh, organizations must look at existing service providers in the country, analyze them to see whether they are capable of supporting their operation. They also need to do cost benefit analysis or total cost of ownership analysis to understand what is what will give them more value, whether in-house will give them more value or outsourcing will give them more value. They also need to look at the process maturity of the logistics service provider, any service provider that they want to employ. Because if the process maturity of the provider is less than the organization, then there is no point in outsourcing. Okay. So how do you manage outsourcing? Like I had told you there in that circular process, expectations have to be clarified at the very beginning from the RFP and contract stage. KPIs and service levels must be agreed on. Uh, those KPIs and service levels must be monitored and reviewed throughout the contract period. And most importantly, there has to be a transparent communication structure between the provider and the organization to sustain the outsourced operation. And that is the key. If you look at any big outsourced providers, they have very good communication structures. They have a very good way of escalation. We call it escalation matrix, where if something goes wrong, it goes from a junior level employee to a senior level employee who would come in and resolve those issues in a timely manner. And for good organizations, they also have time limitations for every kind of issue. Okay. So those kind of things are important to mention in those contracts when we talk about outsourcing. So at this stage, we've talked about why outsourcing is needed. How can an organization, manage outsourcing from beginning to end? We have also looked at the overall process, the cycle, and different conditions that an organization must meet before going for outsourcing. So if you have any questions, with what we have covered so far, please you can ask. You can also um, talk about any experience that you have in outsourcing in Zimbabwe or in any other place that you have worked in. I will take a 10-second pause and then I will move to the next section. Any questions, any clarifications? If you're okay, then we will quickly move forward. So in this session, we don't have any, big discussion, or a breakout. But at any point in time, if you want to ask any questions, please, ask them by all means. Okay, moving on. So, all of you have received a case study document from Gavi, which has various outsourcing cases from different countries. Some are successful examples, some are, I can say, not so successful examples. Here, I would like to discuss with you a successful example from Uganda, uh, which is not which is in East Africa, although from a size perspective, it is, I guess, a bit smaller than Zimbabwe. Uh, and also from a health system model, it's a very different model to that of Zimbabwe as well. So to understand this case, you have to understand that in Uganda, the Ministry of Health, they pay for the products. So the patients, they don't have to pay. There is an organization called NMS, National Medical Store. So just like in Zimbabwe, you have NatFarm. In Uganda, they have NMS. So NMS manages the public sector procurement, warehousing, and transportation of products until the hospitals and service delivery points. So in Uganda, NMS has a national warehouse, and from there the products goes to a something called a district depot. And from district depot, they are then the products are transported to health facilities or service delivery points. So that is generally how uh, products are transported in the country. Now, I think this case has, I mean, if we talk about this case, we need to talk about before and after scenarios. So before Uganda embarked on identifying logistics service provider, everything was done by NMS using their own fleet up to the district depot. And from district depot to the health facilities, it was a challenge. Okay, so it was a real challenge, because of which they embarked on this project. So initially, they designed a pilot where they wanted uh, logistics service provider to transport products from a district depot to the health facilities. So from NMS central warehouse district depots uh, was still managed by NMS in-house fleet because they had a fleet already. The issue that they were facing, so here, see how they decided. So they looked at their functions. They saw that the issue is not uh, between the national warehouse and the district depot, because that is managed well by them. But rather, the issue is when it comes to transporting products from district depots to the health facilities. So that is where they created this intervention, that when they created contracts with two private transporters using a multimodal solution. Multimodal solution is depending on where the products have to be transported, that kind of transport method is used. So whether that is a small pickup truck, whether that is a motorbike, or that is a boat, for example. So the private transporters were responsible to figure out the right kind of vehicle that is required to transport products from district depots in different districts to health facilities. The transporters were selected after rigorous procurement process, and they were given 1 year contracts because it was a pilot. It was decided that a maximum of 5 business days will be allocated to the transport providers to pick up products from district depot and deliver them at the health facility. And 5 business days is the maximum time period. So if the distance is short, they can deliver it sooner. If the distance is long, so that is the maximum permissible time limit. After the pilot, NMS saw that the accuracy and timeliness of product delivery has significantly improved. And also, which is not written on this slide, is that the staff at health facilities found it much simpler to just place the orders, and then the orders would, land on their doorstep through this, transport provider. So they don't need to worry about who will go pick up, or how will the district depot send the products to them. With the success of this project, if you read more in the case study, and if you read more about animals today, this operation has now become nationwide, and they're also in discussion to outsource the transportation between national warehouse and the district depot. So that either in discussion or has already happened. I'm not very sure of what is happening today. My knowledge is about a couple of years old when they were deciding on what to do. Okay, so so that is a great example from Uganda, who has successfully instituted outsourcing in transportation, and they have one of the best supply chain in Eastern and Southern Africa. Okay, so do read about Uganda and think how your own organization can learn something from it, and how, if uh, rather ask the question, if outsourcing can solve some of the problems that you are facing, but also try to think whether in Zimbabwe you would find reliable logistics service providers as well. Okay, so moving on, there is a question. It's a small discussion which I would like to have. What I want to know is if outsourcing is cheaper always, or outsourcing eventually is uh, much more expensive than managing, uh, those functions in-house. So the floor is open to you. Think about it. Either you can speak, or you can also put your responses in the chat. Once I receive a couple of responses, I will read them and also, give you yes, Namsa, you can speak.
Hi. So outsourcing can be cheaper or expensive depending on the scope of the organization that you are working for. So for an example, if you are already into buying and distributing the health products, it will be cheaper for you to have your own fleet and doing the distribution on your own. But if it's a once-off activity and then you have a fleet that's going to be stationary for the rest of the year, because you only did it only once, then it becomes more expensive for you because you're hiring or you're locking up money in equipment or logistics supply that you won't be able to use. So it just depends on the scope of work that you be attending.
Yeah, that's correct, Namsa. Also, try to, not just for you, but for everyone else, also try to think about outsourcing in other supply chain functions. For example, procurement. There are many places where procurement is outsourced, by the way. So, not just transportation, but think about procurement, think about human resource management, think about warehousing as well in many places, especially in private sector. Now, warehousing is consistently outsourced. Organizations don't want to invest in buying land, constructing big warehouses. Rather, there are specialized organizations who create warehouses and then they outsource those warehouses or they lease those warehouses to organizations who need them. It may or may not be very common in Zimbabwe, but there are other places where it is quite common and quite prevalent. To think from other perspectives, but Namsa, you're correct. It depends on the scope of operation or the overall objective. But what I also wanted to think, Namsa, and specific to you, not just to you, but everyone. Uh, when we talk about having an in-house fleet, we always think about investing in that fleet like for once. But that's not the case actually. If you buy 10 trucks, let's say today you've paid for those 10 trucks, but then you also need, if not fully, like if not the entire like 10 drivers, maybe you need 6 or 8 drivers at the very least. You need to recruit people. Then you need fuel. Okay, so you need to, of course, have fuel for those vehicles, and in some countries, fuel is of shortage as well. Then vehicles will break down eventually. So you need to invest in maintenance. Now, whether that maintenance happens uh, outside somewhere or you also create a workshop to maintain your vehicles. So these are some life cycle costs which you also need to consider. Okay. Rather than saying that if you have a continuous operation, then in-house will be cheaper, outsourced will be expensive. But if it is a one-off operation, then outsourced will be cheaper and in-house will be expensive. But in both cases, think about the life cycle costs. Okay. Uh, this is very common that we don't think about life cycle costs. We only think about the one-time cost. Okay, so think about that. Maybe that will also change your opinion. Any other submissions to this question? Mavis is saying, I think it's cheaper because you will have the expert input on what you are outsourcing, hence reducing oversights. Yes, that's a good way of putting it. If you're outsourcing a function, you need to make sure that you find a specialist who is an expert in that area. Because the reason that you are outsourcing is because you are not a specialist in that particular area. So if you hire experts, maybe initially you are paying a bit higher, but then the expertise that they will bring, they will eventually make your operation much more efficient, which may result in cost savings, which may probably offset the high cost that you may have paid initially. Okay, so that's a good response, Mavis. Anyone else would like to contribute to this question? Okay. So if you ask me, like Nomsa said, one, it definitely depends on the scope that you are trying to fulfill, but it also depends on both internal and external parameters. Now, consider a situation where you want to outsource your transportation, but the geography that you are in, let's say the country you are in, logistics service providers, they don't have um expertise or specialization in transporting pharmaceutical products or health products. So in that case, if you choose outsourcing, eventually it will be more expensive because you will have to train your outsourced providers in managing pharmaceutical products. They will have to invest a lot in in vehicles or processes and stuff to manage health products, which eventually they will charge you for that. So in those cases, outsourcing may be more expensive, but in general, for a long-term operation, outsourcing is more often than not cheaper because you don't have to invest in people, you don't have to invest in risk management. When do have to invest in some form of risk management, but not direct risk management because that will be a responsibility of the provider. You don't have to invest in capital equipment. So all those costs you save over a long period of time, that makes outsourcing quite cheaper. But the condition here is that you need to find the right outsourcing provider who can manage the work as per the defined quality and KPI level. Because if that is not met, then the cost that you are paying may not be in the dollar value, but maybe in terms of lives lost, the lives of patients which are lost because medicines or products which were needed did not reach them. Okay, so those kind of things need to be checked. Okay, so moving on, outsourcing may not always be a cakewalk. There are several challenges to it that needs to be managed. A key issue that organizations face is they feel a sense of loss of control. Sometimes, if the contracts were not written properly, outsourced providers can do, as per what they think is correct or right. And more importantly, majority of outsourced providers are for-profit organizations. So they will try to figure out ways to increase their profit always. Okay. Second is communication problems. There can be communication problems again if the RFP and the contracts, it all starts at that stage. If your RFPs and contracts were not designed and communicated clearly, there is a very high chance that those communication problems will remain throughout the contract. Any hidden cost by the supplier, it may come into the equation. Security risks, confidentiality risk. In this case, security also means security of products which are being transported. There are several countries where when they outsource transportation, they also add security to the contract that the provider is responsible to secure this package until it reaches the destination because they face a lot of domestic terrorism, extremism, or people who are engaged in theft or something. Okay, so those kind of issues can also creep up if those things are not mentioned in the contracts. Quality control issues if the provider is not well versed with managing health products. Failure to deliver, so issues with KPIs. Integration difficulties. Integration difficulties mean if your provider or your own staff is not able to integrate with themselves. Okay, and there is a good example I think in the next slide. And then if you have less experience in managing provider staff, because that has to be managed. So if that happens, then you will face some issues. Okay, I think yes. So this is a case from Mozambique, where so this is related to point number 7 and point number 1. So it's a case of Mozambique where the CMS does not want to use outsourced service provider because one, they don't like when the control is not with them. Second, they had real integration challenges because they were used to a way of working which suited them, but then the outsourced provider had a different way of working. As you see, a CMS will say they need flexibility from transporters because pick and pack is manual and they cannot avoid delays. However, uh, critics will always say private transport is more expensive, but a good logistics service provider will want to use their vehicle in a way which gives them most competitive rates, and they don't want to spend or they don't want to keep their vehicles empty for a long time when those vehicles could have gone to some other place where they could have picked and dispatched those products. Okay, so that's an integration issue which happens when organizations try to outsource without proper due diligence or without making plans of integration or without creating any risk management plans. So this is the case from Mozambique, but there are multiple cases. If you see in the case study document which was shared with you, you will see how organizations sometimes find it difficult to work with logistics provider if the logistics provider maybe don't listen to them, or sometimes clients or organizations may also ask some unusual needs, so they may face some integration problem. Okay, so how do you manage risk? The risks are related to the challenges which we discussed earlier. So if there is a loss of control, that kind of issue is expected, then a well-designed plan can help define those responsibilities between the organization and the service provider, and that can manage this issue. If communication problems are expected, then effective project management tools and standard formats of communication can be employed. Uh, any hidden cost or unforeseen costs can be avoided by clearly defining the project requirements or the requirements in your outsourcing operation, and hence getting the costs based on that. Any security and confidentiality risk can be addressed by drawing a very tight contract with SLAs, service level agreement, with the help of lawyers, and also asking the providers to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Okay, so that way any security or confidentiality risks can be avoided. Similarly, quality control issues can be avoided if regular checks and audits are done, and providers are asked to use the methods which are generally used for managing pharmaceutical products, okay, as per good storage and distribution practices. If any service provider fails to deliver, to manage that, it is recommended to have constant check-ins and to create any contingency plan in case one provider fails to deliver. So in that case, maybe you need more than one provider, just like they did in Uganda. So the reason why they signed up with two providers is because if one provider fails in delivering their contract, they don't have to do everything again. They still have one provider who can assume the duties of the other. To manage integration difficulties, uh, it can be a challenge, but it requires a smooth transition process so that the activities which the organization was managing is smoothly transferred over to the service provider, with a way where someone from the organization is involved in working with the service provider for a certain period of time, and it requires financial and time commitment from both parties, because there has to be people working together in making this change. Also, if there is an organization has lack of experience working with providers, teams, or remote teams, then they should choose a service provider who already has a well-established setup for integration or working with clients. Okay, so that can be part of conditions that you ask in the RFP. So these are certain methods with which you can avoid or minimize risk in outsourcing operations. But it really depends on country to country, context to context. Issues can be different with different means of managing them. Okay. I think this is the end of this particular session on outsourcing. It was a bit quick since we did not have many questions asked. But in case you have any questions, or you want to clarify something, or you have any comment, please you can ask them, or otherwise I'll take a pause, and after that we will end this session. We will also try to see which slide was missing, because I feel there is something missing, and then send it to you through email. Also, if you have any questions regarding the current modules, you can also ask them, because we have time today. If you have faced any difficulties in the previous modules, or have a clarification from previous modules, you can ask them now, because we have some time. So it's totally up to you. From my side, I have covered the concepts of outsourcing and how to go about it. This will help you understand how different outsourcing operations are managed. So in case if you are asked to design any outsourcing operation, you should be able to do that. There is a outsourcing toolkit which is available at People That Deliver. Priyanka, please make a note when we send them the email with the recording. We will also send them the link for the outsourcing toolkit. So if anyone is interested in reading more about how to go about outsourcing, and not just in transportation, but in general, there is a very good toolkit developed by People That Deliver, which you should read. But also read the case studies which we have sent you. They are very good. Okay. So any questions, any clarification, any comments, not just about this session, but anything else, they're more than welcome. Okay, in that case, let me launch the feedback poll, and then we will end the session. Okay, couple of people left. If you can, is subcontracting and outsourcing the same? Okay, that's a very good question, and that has come up quite a few times in other classes as well. It is not the same. It is slightly different. So it depends on how many parties, we call it parties generally, or organizations are involved. So let's say the primary organization is Ministry of Health. Let's just assume. So Ministry of Health wants a private logistics service provider to do deliveries of health products from one place to the other. Let's say that's the equation. So they issue the contract to one organization. So that is outsourced. Now that contractor, that logistics service provider, feels that there is a area in the country which they are not highly suited to deliver the products in, but they have a partner who is specialized in making deliveries in that area. And this logistics service provider issues a subcontract. Now, that is where the term is used. They issue a subcontract, and this subcontract is not issued by the ministry. It is issued by the logistics service provider under the same conditions which the Ministry of Health has given them. So when they subcontract part of their work to another organization, it is called subcontracting. Okay, so it is not saying it depends on who issues the contract. So when a first organization issues the contract, it's called a contract. But if the organization who has received the contract subsequently issues another contract to someone else for the same activity, then it is called subcontracting. Okay. Thank you, Vincent. That is a very good question, and it has come up almost in every class that we take for outsourcing. So good that you are also thinking along the same line. Thank you for your feedback. We appreciate. But in case if you don't have any questions, then I will end today's session.